So now that we've talked about sort of an example of how a system is controlled homeostatically, I want to actually introduce the system that is generating some of the signals that we talked about. So the system that is sort of the umbrella system that controls the vasopressin and aldosterone release, in addition to a bunch of the other hormones that are circulating that help us maintain kind of our daily functionality on a physiological level. So here's our funny cartoon for the day. Your hormones are out of balance. We need to get them more to the other side because, play on the word balance. Anyway, okay, moving on. So what is a hormone? A hormone is very similar in a lot of ways to a neurotransmitter in that it is a chemical secreted by one group of cells and carried to another cell or received by another cell group. The difference is that the hormones are released by a different group of cells in many cases, and that the mode of transport is completely different. So instead of being released across a synapse, which is a very small area, very specialized mode of communication, a hormone is a chemical that is released into the bloodstream and then sent basically anywhere that the bloodstream goes. So just kind of going with that parallel, instead of having a synapse, we're releasing into the bloodstream. And as such, because the release is into such a non-specific pool, anything that has receptors for that hormone is going to be activated. So you're not activating a specific circuit like you are in neural signaling. You're activating anything that has a vasopressin receptor or an aldosterone receptor. And then you may just hear this as the study of hormones being referred to as endocrinology. So when we talk about the hormone system, we're talking about the endocrine system. And if you break apart that word, endo being inside, crin being signaling, so this is the endocrine system. So there are a bunch of types of signaling, and we've actually already talked about several of them, but I kind of want to give you an idea of the scale of different signaling modalities that we can talk about when we're talking about sort of behavioral communication. So starting on the smallest scale, we've talked about neurocrine signaling. So neurocrine signaling being just neuronal signaling or neural signaling across the synapse. We've also talked a little bit about autocrine signaling. So this is where the released chemical acts on the releasing cell. So think about, I'm not going to give you this answer, but think about a scenario where we've talked about autocrine signaling, and we can talk about it when we get back to class on Monday, but plant that in your heads. Paracrine signaling we haven't talked about a whole lot, but that's where you just have some sort of chemical signal released into the extracellular fluid and it drifts to nearby cells. There's not a specific modality that's carrying it to specific cells. It's not as small of a gap as your neurocrine signaling, your neurocrine function, but it's only getting into sort of the neighboring cells. So things like immune responses tend to be paracrine signaling. Then we move to endocrine signaling, which we're going to talk about in this video. And we haven't talked about pheromone signaling, but now pheromone signaling is moving outside the body. It's released by an animal into the outside world, but to communicate to members of the same species. So a pheromone is an external chemical signal that is generally only going to be sensed by members of your species, which is in contrast to allomone signaling, which is chemical signals released to the outside world to communicate with other species. So pheromones, I think we've all kind of probably heard about, at least in some nebulous detail, about attracting mates and whether or not humans have pheromones, and we can talk about that if you want on Monday. Allomones are things like the scents given off by flowers or the scents given off by other animals. So skunk stink is an allomone signal. It's signaling to the rest of the world that you do not want to hang out with our little skunk friend because he is full of stink and will make you full of stink. So that's an allomone signal. So that's kind of from the very small to the very large, the way that we use chemical signals to communicate both within our body and to the outside world. Like I said, though, today we're going to focus on our endocrine signaling. And then, like I said before, endocrine and neurocrine signaling are very, very similar in a lot of ways. So As with neurocrine signaling, endocrine signaling involves the release of stored chemicals, so chemicals stored in our endocrine cells. They are released in a regulated manner. They're not just leaking out of our endocrine cells. They're released in response to some sort of activation, be it a sensation coming from the blood where we're sensing that there's not enough water in the blood and we thus need to trigger a thirst response, or whether it's something coming down from somewhere neurally where we're talking about in training some of our hormone response to light-dark cycles. There is regulation of this release. Just like neural signaling, endocrine signaling is chemicals binding to receptors and leading to, signaling cascades. Couple of differences is that obviously neurocrine signaling is very fast over a very short specific area, and that it's kind of mostly all or none, meaning that each action potential looks the same. Endocrine signaling can be much more graded, so it's not in response to an action potential necessarily. And obviously, because we're relying on the blood to transport the signal to the rest of the body, it is slower communication over a much broader area. And also, we'll talk about this in a minute, but as a corollary to this, it tends to be longer lasting because we don't have the same reuptake mechanisms that we do in neurons. We're not releasing hormone into the blood and then sucking it out as soon as we're done with it. We're releasing hormone into the blood and it is broken down over time, but because we're talking about such a broad area and we're releasing it to the whole body, the effects tend to be much longer lasting. So where neurons are on the order of, seconds, milliseconds, possibly up to minutes when we're talking about some of the changes we see with metabotropic receptors, with endocrine, the fastest you're going to get something is on the order of seconds to minutes to hours, and some of these changes last, up to days. So just to give you a little history lesson, because it's fairly entertaining the way we came about and the study of endocrinology. And it's something, again, we sort of see this a lot in science, where you accidentally stumble on things through behavioral discoveries, and it turns out that then when we backtrack, there's a biochemical explanation for it. So the study of endocrinology actually began with the discovery of this notion that in cases of war or aggression, or where one society was taking over another, or one tribe was taking over another, they found that if you castrated the males of the tribe that you had taken over, it reduced or presented the expression of several traditionally male traits. So you lost aggression and dominance behavior, you lost sexual appetite, you saw reductions in muscle development and physical strength. It made it much easier to subjugate the population that you had castrated. So this is something I'm not entirely sure the trial and error process that went into this, but this is a discovery that sort of behaviorally was happened upon, probably thousands of years ago. So this sort of led to the idea that the male genitalia were recognized as sort of the locus of maleness and power in patriarchal societies, which most societies are. So on the flip side of this, in Eastern traditions, animal testes have been used to treat impotence. So you grind up animal testes and you give them to people in tinctures and teas and what have you. And it was thought to help treat impotence and sort of the lack of traditional male behaviors. And so both sides of this sort of experimental fence were tested over the course of thousands of years and were found to have some validity. So fast forward hundreds, possibly thousands of years, to probably early 1900s, and we actually did some laboratory type experiments to confirm these sort of experientially determined properties of the male testes. So what they did is they took 3 groups of male chickens or male chicks and did a couple of different things. So the first group was the control group, and so they left our male chick undisturbed, let them turn into roosters, looked at the characteristics of the roosters, and found that they developed as normal roosters would. The second group, they castrated, and so this was sort of the test case for the subjugation paradigm. So they castrated these male chicks and watched what happened, and they found that they developed some male characteristics, but they were dramatically reduced compared to the control group of regular male roosters. Okay, so group 3 was the interesting group because they castrated group 3 and then just implanted the testes into the abdominal cavity, making sure that they had adequate blood supply. The testes, not the roosters. So they reconnected the testes into the abdominal cavity, just plunked them in there, hooked them up to some blood supply, and let them go. And what they found was that if you lodge the testes somewhere in the abdominal cavity and make sure that it has adequate blood supply, the male chicks turned into normal roosters. So this allowed us to conclude that, in fact, yes, there is something about the testes that does sort of control the maleness of the animal, but there's nothing special about the location of the testes that was important for this. Anytime that the testes had access to the blood supply, they were able to exert their normal testes effects, okay? So this was really scientifically interesting because previously what we knew was, neurons have to communicate in very tightly sort of set up circuits. If you sever neuronal connections, you don't get the same reconnection. You can't just release neurotransmitter into the ether and get normal behavioral effects. So this really differentiated the study of endocrinology from the study of neurocrinology, because now we could just hook things up to blood supply and have normal effects. So as we continued our study of the endocrine system, we found that there are still a lot of parallels, and you may notice some very tight parallels here in that there are some hormones in the endocrine system that are literally identical to the neurotransmitters in the neurotransmission systems. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, the exact same molecules that are released in the brain, are also released in the bloodstream as a stress response, and they bind to the same receptors on the tissues that you have in the brain and exert many of the same effects on the cells. There are also a huge host of other chemicals that we release in the hormone system that you don't see in the neural system. So we'll talk about some of these in a little bit. But there are also, like I said, similarly classed and similarly structured. So we have peptide neurotransmitters. We also have protein and peptide hormones. We obviously have amine neurotransmitter. We also have amine hormones. The class of hormones that we do not have in neurotransmitter systems is these steroid hormones. And so we'll talk about how these are sort of different from the others, but the sort of main thrust is that they are in fact completely differently structured. And the thing that makes them really interesting is they are all derived from the same molecule, which is the cholesterol molecule. So we'll come back to steroid hormones and why they're so interesting in a minute, but just know that they are kind of a class of endocrine signal that we don't have in normal neurocrine signaling. Okay. So as you may have guessed, based on the fact that we're just dumping stuff into the bloodstream and that we have much longer lasting actions, hormones act exclusively, to our knowledge, on metabotropic receptors. So some of them are very similar or identical, like I said, to the G protein coupled receptors, the metabotropic receptors that we talked about in the brain. Some of them are completely different. So this is another area where the steroid hormones differ from anything that we've seen before. So because steroid hormones are hydrophobic in structure, they can cross the cell membrane pretty freely. So they can diffuse across the cell membrane. They don't need a transporter. They don't need any special carrier. They don't need a channel. And they can then be taken up into the cell. And the receptors for our steroid hormones are actually located inside the cell. They're not on the cell membrane like they are with the other metabotropic receptors. They're buried inside the cell. And the way that these steroid hormones signal is that they bind to these intracellular receptors, and then the complex is transported into the nucleus, and it generally will alter the expression of genes in our genome. And so what you see with steroid hormones is that they tend to have even longer lasting effects than our standard metabotropic receptor binding chemicals. So steroids tend to have much longer effects because they're altering gene expression. They're altering the way the cell functions on a much longer term scale than just modifying the function of an existing receptor. Okay, so we can kind of put these in order where we have neurotransmitter signals are faster and shorter acting than hormone signals. Within the neurotransmitter signals, ionotropic receptors act more quickly than metabotropic receptors. Standard metabotropic receptors act more quickly than steroid receptors. Okay, so you kind of have ionotropic, the G protein coupled metabotropic receptors, the steroid receptors being the slowest. And so the other hallmark of the endocrine system, because we are sort of releasing things into the broad circulation, is that you get a lot more feedback than you would in the neurotransmitter system. So you get two major modes of feedback in the endocrine system. The first one is, like I said when we were talking about thirst, monitoring that biological response. So monitoring how much water is in the blood, monitoring our body temperature, monitoring that we have sufficient testosterone in the circulation, monitoring that we have the correct amount of gonadal activity, things like that. And that gets fed back, generally speaking, to the hypothalamus. You do get some kind of feedback to other parts of the brain. But like I said, this is really the gatekeeper. So the hypothalamus is constantly monitoring all of our different physiological systems and making sure everything's in check. You also get direct chemical feedback from the things being released into the blood. So you're monitoring the actual hormone levels, you're monitoring the releasing hormone levels, you're monitoring all the steps in the process to make sure that each organ in this chain is doing what it needs to, is putting the right amount of hormone into the circulation to exert the biological response that we're looking for. So these two things are working in concert, but just be aware that they are, again, redundant feedback systems. A little bit more deeply into how this all works, that last slide kind of gives you this idea that this is in fact a multi-step controlled process to get to the end hormone that's acting on the target cells, that's eliciting that biological response. So here is kind of the bigger picture of how that works, and kind of gives you the idea of the hierarchy of how our major hormone systems are acting. So this isn't an exhaustive tour of every hormone system. There are hormones that we're not even going to talk about today, but these are kind of the major homeostatic developmental control systems that we'll talk about briefly today. So all of them adhere to this major same pathway wherein the brain and the blood are feeding into the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is acting sort of as the gatekeeper, the master gland. The hypothalamus releases something to the pituitary. The pituitary releases something into the bloodstream that goes to our target organs, which are basically the workhorses that then manufacture the hormones that go out into the periphery and act on all of the general cells in your body. Okay, so this seems like a very kind of unnecessarily complex process, but remember that I said that all of these systems do kind of talk to each other and feed back on each other. So having these two unified areas that are kind of keeping track of all the different things that are going on is actually really helpful. What this also allows is that you don't have to have a single organ in a single location in your brain that's manufacturing all of the different major hormones that go out. So you're allowed to kind of outsource things to other parts of the body so you can specialize in adrenal hormone production, testicular hormone production, ovarian hormone production, obviously not in the same species, or not in the same genders, liver hormone production, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so starting at the top, we have the hypothalamus. I've talked about this kind of ad nauseum at this point. Again, it's just the site of interface between the nervous system and the endocrine system. From the nervous system, it's not getting direct projections from the prefrontal cortex. It's mostly getting input from the brainstem nuclei, so the things that are more sort of automatic programs. It's not getting as much in the decision making, although that sort of information does end up filtering down to the brainstem at some point. Then we move to the pituitary, which is often referred to as the master gland, which is a bit of a misnomer because it's actually almost two glands that are kind of glued together. And the reason that I say it's two glands is that it actually originates from two different spots in the developmental process. So the posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, that's what this is, originates from neural tube tissue. So this is neural crest in origin. And the anterior pituitary, or the adenohypophysis, originates from the oral ectoderm. So it's somatic tissue in origin. So it's coming from two totally different layers of the embryo. It just happens that these two kind of migrate together, both get input from the hypothalamus, and both are involved in endocrine signaling. But like I said, evolutionarily, developmentally, they originate from different tissue layers. They just happen to subserve similar functions in a similar location, but they do not communicate between the two. They are not a unified organ. Okay, it's kind of important. So let's talk about these two parts. So starting with the posterior pituitary, which is the more simple of the two, more straightforward. Again, this is from neural tissue in origin. So it behaves a lot more like neural tissue, you would expect neural tissue to behave. So you have what's called neurosecretory neurons in the hypothalamus whose axons project, and you basically are just synapsing onto a blood vessel here. So they're getting neural input. They release in sort of an action potential like manner, and they're released in sort of a quantal manner, vesicle release, all of that. And so the two neurohormones that are released from the posterior pituitary are oxytocin, which we have not talked about, and arginine vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone, which we did talk about in the thirst portion. So this is directly releasing from the hypothalamus into the circulatory system, and then it goes directly to the target organs that are having receptors for these two hormones. So we talked again, like I said, about vasopressin. It regulates water balance. It constricts blood vessels to increase blood pressure, decreases urine formation and output. The other thing that's really interesting about vasopressin is it seems like it may play a role in promoting social interaction and closeness. This is a relatively recent development that we think this is going on. So we're not entirely sure how these two systems interact. They seem to be completely distinct, and it's hard to tell how they differ, but there does seem to be a role in animals that have higher levels of vasopressin being more social animals, and the lower animals with lower basal levels of vasopressin seem to be more individual. Again, this is sort of a new avenue of research though, so we don't know a whole lot about how this all comes together. Oxytocin we know a little bit more about. So oxytocin plays a number of roles in reproduction and parenting. The main things that we know that it does is it triggers uterine contractions during childbirth, so it's responsible for those contractions. It's instrumental in the milk letdown reflex, so the contraction of mammary glands when you're breastfeeding, and it's also released during orgasm. So you can kind of generalize oxytocin, this is a lot easier to unify, as related to promoting smooth muscle contractions of a reproductive nature. So reproductively oriented smooth muscle contractions tend to be oxytocin driven. And again, this is released from these neurosecretory neurons in the hypothalamus directly into the bloodstream, directly to the target organs, in this case, the smooth muscle of your reproductive organs. Okay, so those guys are pretty straightforward. The anterior pituitary is where things start getting crazy. So, like I said, it seems like an unnecessarily complicated process, but there are reasons that it kind of makes sense that you would want to not be forcing your pituitary to basically drive all of these different hormones to the rest of your body, some of them just being space-saving in nature. So what we have in the anterior pituitary, which remember is derived from somatic tissue during development, is that you have neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus that release into what we call the portal vein system, which is just this sort of mini circulatory system that traffics between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So these neurosecretory cells release what's called a releasing hormone, here into the portal system, and those releasing hormones are then sensed by the endocrine cells within the anterior pituitary, and those endocrine cells in response produce what we call tropic hormones into the general circulation, which then travel to the target glands. Okay, so let's watch a quick video on this, and this is using the thyroid system.
Within the base of the forebrain is the hypothalamus, a region of the brain that integrates information from the rest of the body and regulates most of the body's endocrine systems. An example of an endocrine system regulated by the hypothalamus is the hypothalamo-pituitary axis. Some neurons within the hypothalamus produce and secrete thyrotropin-releasing hormone.
So that's your releasing
TRH.
hormone.
TRH is secreted into the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal vessels and carried into the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland.
So here's
where it
our
stimulates cells that make
endocrine cells.
thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH.
So that's our
TRH
tropic
stimulates
hormone.
the release of TSH from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. TSH enters the bloodstream and is carried to the thyroid gland. At the thyroid gland, TSH stimulates the production and release of thyroxine, a hormone that regulates the metabolic rate of all the cells in the body. In addition to regulating our metabolic rate, thyroxine inhibits the TRH-containing neurons within the hypothalamus.
So there's our
This
feedback.
inhibition results in decreased release of TRH, and thus a decrease in secretion of TSH and thyroxine. This is called a negative feedback loop and occurs frequently in the endocrine system.
All right, so that was using this pathway as an example, but again, you get neurally controlled release from your neurosecretory cells into the portal system. You release that releasing hormone into the portal system, which acts on the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary. These cells release your tropic hormones, in this case, thyrotropin stimulating hormone, or thyroid stimulating hormone rather, or thyrotropin, which is then released into the general circulation, which acts on the thyroid, which makes your T4 and T3, which we'll talk about in a second. And then, like they mentioned, this is all feeding back into this hypothalamic sensory system. So the other upside of having all of these multiple steps is that the hypothalamus can kind of check in each step along the way and make sure the right amount of thyrotropin releasing hormone is being released into the portal system, that the right amount of thyroid stimulating hormone is being released into the general circulation, and then making sure that the right amount of thyroid hormone is circulating to get the desired behavioral effect. Okay, so that's the multi-step sort of signaling feedback, and then in addition, you're monitoring metabolism to make sure that the endpoint is getting where it needs to be. So, like I said, we just watched this video. This is the flow chart that the thyroid hormone goes through. So you sense that something needs to be tweaked about your metabolism. You get that signal in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. That's the purple here. The anterior pituitary senses thyrotropin releasing hormone, releases thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes into the general circulation. The thyroid gland has receptors for thyroid stimulating hormone, and it produces thyroid hormones, which then go out to the general tissues and promote the necessary changes in metabolism. So I also kind of alluded to this, thyroid hormones, just kind of informational, regulate growth, metabolism, and alertness. So basically it's all tied back to metabolism. If your metabolism is going at a high rate, you can drive more growth because you're able to sort of use more energy. If you have, the metabolism is also tied in with alertness, so you can really kind of bring it all back to metabolism. If you need a lot more energy for growth and alertness, then you'll need to elevate the metabolism. If your metabolism is reduced, you'll find that the symptoms tend to be things like lethargy, inability to create body heat, things like that. There are also some developmental consequences. If you have low thyroid hormones, which are related to sort of an inability to drive the necessary growth processes, so small stature is something that you see developmentally if you have untreated hypothyroidism. There are also some malformities in the facial structure. They're not dramatic, but there are some characteristic differences. And you also see difficulties with cognitive development because, again, making neuronal connections is an energetically expensive process, and so we need to be able to drive enough energy production to make that happen. So just a fun little tidbit about thyroid hormone and the thyroid system, thyroid signaling system. Back in the days of yore, when we were just emerging from being a completely agrarian society to expanding our population into areas that maybe didn't have as naturally fortified soils, we started kind of growing things, like I said, in places that weren't naturally fortified, that wouldn't naturally support a lot of agriculture growth. And we started adding fertilizers to kind of help with that, but obviously we weren't replacing all of the nutrients that we needed. And so one thing that started to happen is we started moving into these areas that were not sort of naturally great agricultural areas, is we started seeing people developing something called goiters, which are swellings in the neck area. And it's something that sort of we couldn't figure out what was going on, but this is what a goiter looks like. And eventually we figured out through some hormonal testing that what was happening was that whatever soil that we were using and whatever fertilizers that we were adding were not replacing the levels of iodine in the soil, because nobody really thinks about iodine as being super important nutritively. But it turns out that iodine is absolutely critical in the production of thyroid hormones. And in fact, if you don't have enough iodine in your diet or enough iodine in your body, you make the backbone of thyroid hormones, but you can't put these sort of iodine decorations on the thyroid hormone, which means that these sort of non-iodinated thyroid hormones can't bind to the receptors on your tissues and regulate your metabolism. So the end point of your endocrine system for thyroid hormone is not sensing that there's any thyroid hormone being produced. You're completely unable to regulate your metabolism. And so what happens as a consequence is that the receptors that are supposed to be sensing this T3 and T4, the 3 and the 4 being how many iodines are on the thyroid hormone, the receptors for T3 and T4 are not sensing that any thyroid hormone is being reduced or is being produced. Your metabolic sensors in the hypothalamus are not able to sense sort of the outcomes or the behavioral outcome of metabolism adjustment, and so it sends information that says, oh, we need more thyroid hormone. So we stimulate the release of thyrotropin releasing hormone, we stimulate the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, we tell the thyroid to produce more thyroid hormone, the thyroid produces more of the backbone, but it still doesn't have iodines to decorate it, so the receptors can't sense that this is being produced, so they send more signals up here. And it's like, hey, we're still not producing thyroid hormone. Ramp it up again. And so what happens here is that you keep ramping up these hormonal signals, trying to produce more and more thyroid hormone. And what happens is that your thyroid, just like any other organ or tissue that you're using a lot, starts to build mass, kind of like a muscle, to be able to ramp up more production of the thyroid hormone. So this is pumping out just gallons and gallons, that may be an exaggeration, but tons and tons of this undecorated thyroid hormone, and it keeps being stimulated to produce more, so it keeps swelling and making more tissue to be able to feed the demand that is coming down from the endocrine system. And that's what you get, is this swelling of the neck, which is basically your giant thyroid that's trying to produce thyroid hormone, but that thyroid hormone is not getting sensed because you don't have the iodine to decorate so that your receptors can actually identify this. So kind of ugly, kind of a terrible situation. Fortunately, as with most endocrine issues, relatively easy to fix. So what we could do in this case is just give people synthetic thyroid hormone with the iodines already on there. That's easy enough. Or we can just supplement our diets with iodine. And the easiest way to do this is to put it in salt, because we use salt in a variety of things. And we certainly, if we add iodine to our salt, we'll get enough iodine in our diets to prevent this from happening. So that was why now, if you look at most of the salt in the grocery store, it's iodized salt. That was just the cheapest and easiest way to supplement people's diets to make up for the fact that we're growing our produce in iodine poor soils, and thus kind of removing that from our diet. So the take home is that iodized salt is your friend. The other take home being that, everybody's all into using sea salt and rock salt and natural salt, which is great and totally fine for seasoning, but just kind of don't be too creepy about it, and make sure that you eat something with iodized salt in it from time to time, or you might end up with a goiter. But again, don't freak out, because even like stuff that you're getting at restaurants is using iodized salt. So even if you want to season things in your own home with sea salt or whatever, that's totally fine. You're still probably getting plenty, but just kind of a fun anecdote about an endocrine signaling study. All right, so the other system I want to talk about really quickly, because it sets us up nicely for our discussion of sexual development and differentiation next week, is the corticosteroid system. And there's a couple of reasons to talk about this. One, like I said, it sets us up nicely for the steroid signaling that we talk about with sexual differentiation. The other reason is that it gives you an idea of kind of, again, another example of the redundancy of systems. So starting off simply with something that's familiar, corticosteroid system. Starting in the hypothalamus, we have corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, released into the portal system, where we release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, into the by the anterior pituitary, released to the adrenal cortex, which sits on top of your kidney, adrenal being kidney, which is then producing corticosteroids and other stress hormones that are released into the general circulation and mediate our stress response. So zooming in on the adrenal gland for just a second, again, I said it rests on top of the kidney. It, like the pituitary, also has two kind of separate components. The interesting thing here is that these two compartments actually do work together despite being derived from different tissues developmentally. So you can kind of guess the adrenal medulla is derived from neural tissue during development. The adrenal cortex is again derived from somatic tissue during development. So it's similar to the pituitary, except here we have a little bit more of a unified function in that both of these portions of the adrenal gland mediate some of our stress response. So fairly straightforward. The medulla is, like I said, fairly straightforward. You're getting pretty much direct neural stimulation from the hypothalamus to the adrenal medulla. So you have a neuron that is projecting into here that is releasing probably glutamate that mediates the release from the adrenal medulla of epinephrine and norepinephrine, except instead of being released onto neurons here, we're releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream, but we have the same sorts of metabotropic epinephrine and norepinephrine receptors on our somatic tissues, and so you have a lot of the same or similar effects of general activation, increase of the fight or flight response. The other segment of the adrenal gland is the adrenal cortex, and so that's the outside portion of the adrenal gland, and it, similar to the thyroid, is getting input from the anterior pituitary. So it's getting, this is what we're looking at when we're looking at this, is this releasing hormone to tropic hormone to the adrenal cortex, which releases corticosteroids into the general circulation. All right, so I mostly just talked through all of this, so I'm not going to linger here, but you can kind of read through it as you like. Let Also talked through this, so that's good. One thing I want to point out that we're going to come back to is this idea that adrenal corticoids involve a number of different things. So one is this glucocorticoid that I talked about. These are the ones that are most identified with the stress response. But there are other things being released in response to ACTH, one of which is the mineralocorticoids, and some of which are sex steroids. Okay, so this is actually where most of the testosterone produced by females is manufactured, is in the adrenal gland. Again, we'll come back to this. So glucocorticoids are stress hormones. In humans, it's cortisol. In rodents, it's corticosterone. Basically the same thing, just slightly different structures. These do the things that you generally think about as happening when you activate your sympathetic nervous system. So increasing glucose presence in the blood, so you can drive increased cell metabolism. So if you need to engage a lot of muscle contractions, or if you need to make decisions that require a lot more brain power, you have the fuel necessary to do that. You're increasing protein metabolism, so the production of proteins in case you need to repair damage. We suppress immune function because, if you are running away, my favorite example, running away from a bear, you don't want to be dealing with the fact that, oh, I have a bruise and I have a little swelling. You want to be devoting all your resources into decision making and escape or fight or strategy or whatever you need to do. And then as a corollary to this, you would have an anti-allergic response. So this is kind of goes with the same immune suppression. So again, allowing temporary suppression of non-essential functions to mobilize energy to deal with acute stressors. So this is actually, these last two things are why we give prednisone in cases of things like severe reactions to poison ivy or any other thing, autoimmune disorders, cases of organ transplant, where we want to suppress immune function. We give basically synthetic stress hormones to do that. Now, the problem is that you get the other corollary of stress hormones, which means that you get suppression of your entire immune system, leaving you open to other maladies. You also get this sort of chronically elevated stress response and some of the correlations that come with that. So some of the cardiovascular issues, there are actually cognitive issues with long-term increases in stress response. So on the upside, your poison ivy goes away. You're not rejecting your organ transplant, but there are sort of side effects that you have to be aware of sort of a chronic increase in your stress response, a chronic exogenous increase in your stress response. Okay, one of the other things that is released from your adrenal gland is something that's familiar, so we're just going to talk for a second about it, is the aldosterone that we talked about that is released in response to thirst. So again, it's involved in maintaining mineral and ion balance. We're retaining sodium, which results in the reuptake of more fluid, so you're increasing blood volume. And we already talked about that. So this is the site of release of that aldosterone that we talked about in the previous video. And the third thing, like I said, is sex hormones. So you get release of various sex hormones, the most notable or the most commonly understood of which is testosterone. Androstenedione is a precursor to testosterone, and the only reason I include it here is that for some time in the world of baseball in the mid to late 90s, a lot of our heavy-hitting baseball players were using andro, which is basically just a synthetic androstenedione, which their body then converted into testosterone. So they were getting around the idea of using anabolic steroids because they weren't actually using an anabolic steroid. They were using a precursor to an anabolic steroid. Okay, so basically the same thing, but not regulated the same, so great. There's yet another metabolism step. So testosterone can be turned into something called dihydrotestosterone, which will become really important next week when we talk about development. It's basically like a super potent, remember what potent means? A super potent version of testosterone. So it takes a tiny little bit to have this very potent testosterone effect. I'm going to come back to that. Interestingly, dihydrotestosterone is the molecule that's most implicated in male pattern baldness. So it seems like men who have this pattern baldness actually have an excess of this super testosterone, which you can sort of think of as making them super excessively manly, if you really want to go down that road. But what's interesting is that a treatment for this dihydro or this male pattern baldness is basically to block dihydrotestosterone, which is to block the enzyme that is responsible for the conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, which is great because it stops the hair loss and regrows hair in a large number of men. It's also used to treat some types of prostate cancer where testosterone or DHT specifically can actually increase the growth of the cancer cells. The downside is that you also lose the benefits of having this dihydrotestosterone, so you actually get some feminization effects. So you get things like erectile dysfunction, gynecomastia, which is swelling of the breast tissue in men. And then, of course, we'll talk about this when we talk about differentiation, but it may cause actual birth defects if pregnant women carrying male fetuses handle the pills, because if you're blocking that enzyme during development, you get some really kind of interesting birth defects. So upside, you have your hair back. Downside, you have potential sexual dysfunction and man boobs. So, it's an interesting thing to kind of think about if you're dealing with baldness issues. Now, going back to this slide, I want to kind of put forth, and this is again an introduction, and we will come back to this slide about 100 times next week. But this is a really interesting slide because it gives you a picture of why this one single organ can release 3 major different classes of hormones. So you have this aldosterone being released here, you have the glucocorticoids being released here, you have the sex hormones being released here. They're all coming from, like I said, this initial cholesterol precursor. And all you need to get from cholesterol to these different hormones is to have the right combination of enzymes to modify that initial cholesterol. And so this is why a single organ can release 3 totally different acting hormones, is that they are structurally similar enough that if you have the right enzyme combination, you can make all 3 of them. And then the difference in function, kind of going back all the way to neurotransmission, the difference in function of these 3 molecules depends entirely on the receptors that are available on specific tissues and what those tissues do. So any tissue with an aldosterone receptor is going to be activated by aldosterone, even if aldosterone, cortisol, and DHT are being released in the bloodstream, that tissue is only going to be responding to the aldosterone. Similarly, the tissues with cortisol receptors are only going to be responding to the cortisol. So we can be dumping all 3 hormones from the same gland into the bloodstream and still have relatively specific effects. So anyway, that's just an introduction to this idea. We will come back to it and talk about it in greater detail next week, but that is plenty of internet lecturing for now, so I will leave you with that, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.